this is exam number 2, chapters 5, 6, and 7. And there will be an exam 3 that will cover chapters 8 and 9. But as we'll see in chapter 9, that material is essentially comprehensive and covers everything from chapter 3, 4, 7, 8, and 9, essentially. In other words, our core model. When we get to chapter 9 next week, you'll see that, and you have a little glimpse of that at the end of chapter 8. That's why I wanted to at least get started with reading chapter 8. It'll give you a little head start and not get you behind next week. And we'll spend 2 weeks on chapter 9. So we'll have our 3rd exam right after that. You'll see it on the schedule in Blackboard, right? The course schedule. So it'll be roughly won't be, it'll be roughly, let's see, 2.5 weeks after this one, 2.5 to 3 weeks after this one, something like that. Maybe 3 weeks after this one. And then we will have one additional exam on the material that will cover the last part of the course, the last 3 weeks of the course, which will be a sets of readings. I'm still putting those together, but it will have to do with some issues related to equality or quality of outcomes in terms of distribution of income, not just the amount of income, maybe differential effects, economic impacts on different groups within the economy from COVID, intergenerational economic mobility, and some topics along those lines. So it's material that's not in the textbook. It will extend what we have been doing, but will be related, to modern topics that have, especially over the last year, on both COVID-related areas as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, or as some people call it, JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. I'm becoming JEDIs. So that will take us out to the end. There will be a project. There's not a there's a 4th exam, Eric, to get back to your original question. It's not a final exam. This is actually different than I've done in the past. I've usually had a comprehensive final exam during finals week. The last exam will cover those last 3 weeks, whatever material we go over during that time. As we start to transition next week, you'll hear more about the FRED project, Federal Reserve Economic Data Project, which is related to the material in Chapter 8. I mentioned that in the video that I created last night for Chapter 8. And then it'll be a preparation for our macroeconomic briefing report, which is a report, a project that will ask you to summarize current economic activity in the U.S. and make a forecast using our economic model that will be developed, that we have developed, but will through the lens of business cycles in chapters 8 and 9 for the next 6 months. So it's a project, it's a report, and we'll talk more about that and more specifically, but right now it's meant to be an authentic kind of task that if you were working, I see you, Ajar, hold on just a second. An authentic kind of task that will ask you to that an employer could actually say, I have a presentation to give to the board next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I know you're an economics major, you're a new hire. I need you to give me a summary of the economy and where the economy is going to be 6 months from now, right? Which is a legitimate kind of task that an employer could get to you as a new graduate. You should be able to do that. So that's what that is, and you can use that. You can actually use that paper as part of a job search, for example. If that's the point. Hey, Jara, I see your hands up.
Yeah, just two quick questions in reference to what you've said so far.
Mhm.
Or well, actually one of them is a reference, one of them's not. So firstly, just to confirm, our next exam is not going to be April 8th. It's going to be later than that now.
Um, it will, hold on,
I know
let
you're
me,
mentioning like 2.5, 3 weeks from now.
yeah, so let's take a look. Hold on, just let me bring that up. So, what I have done, thank you for that. What I have done, hold on, bring it up to my Blackboard, Blackboard course here. Um, that's true. Sorry, I may have misspoke before. We may we may keep that date that's there. Thursday the 9th, Thursday, April 9th. So we actually may keep that. Sorry, I may have not spoken quite correctly there. Or it could be that it moves into the beginning of week 12. We'll kind of see how things go. Um, that will, during the next 2 weeks related to chapter 9. My guess is we've moved the other ones essentially 1 or 2 days, or exam 1 and exam 2. Or if it was like a Tuesday, Thursday class, would be, it would be like moving it to the next class in that sense. But we'll see how things go. I may give you that weekend prior to week 12. I'm looking at the schedule, and this is what presumably we're looking at, Ishara. That's posted in Blackboard, has been, all right, PDF. Yeah. Thank you for kind of correcting me there, or pointing that out, I should say. We'll see. It could be on that Thursday yet, but probably that following Tuesday.
Okay, so either the 8th or the 13th, but likely the 13th. I just need to know for like.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, I agree. That's important. I appreciate you bringing this up. So, well, actually, what I said, now I have my calendar up, because what I actually said before would be about 2.5 weeks from now would be that Thursday, which is what I said, 2.5 to 3 weeks. So that's still correct, what I said. So, yeah, probably the 13th, Tuesday the 13th, probably the Tuesday rather than Thursday the 8th. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And
Yeah,
then
no, I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you. Yeah.
no problem. A question. I'm sorry. Okay, the other question was just so we don't need to like print out the exam or anything, right? Like it's fine if we just work on it like up in front of us on the computer,
Yep.
write out our answers
Yep.
and scan that. Okay,
Absolutely. 100%. Yep. Absolutely.
all right, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, Dr. Simmons, I'm reviewing, through the stuff, and I'm just kind of realizing, like, I feel like I know so much, like I've learned so much in this course, but it's just like, I don't know, I just feel like certain things I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I feel like I still have a lot more to learn.
That's good, because there's still a lot. There's still, like, we're not at the end of the semester yet.
Right.
I know everybody, and this is true in a regular semester, not even a COVID semester, right?
Mhm.
Everybody feels like, we get past, kind of whatever spring break. We don't have spring break, but some people around the country do, as you see in the news in Miami Beach, right? But people think like, well, like we're almost done. Like,
Mhm.
no, we got, we got like 5-6 weeks left, you know. You know, so yeah, there's a third of the semester left, right? So yes, there's a lot more to learn. But what should happen? So I want to pick up on that, Eric, that what my hope, so I'm glad to hear that you feel like you've been learning and are learning and have learned a lot already in the semester. It's not uncommon to feel anxious or uncertain about, like, well, yeah, but I don't really feel comfortable because I think there's more, and I'm not sure how it all fits together exactly yet. And so I'm hoping that over the next 2 to 3 weeks, that there's an aha moment for people, because we're not adding any more sort of new markets to our model, but we're going to take all the stuff that we know and put it all together, right? And so that's an opportunity to go back kind of and review and look back over things that aren't clear, and hopefully you can see how they all fit together at that point, right? So yeah, it isn't necessarily going to be all together yet, but I'm going to talk about and I'm going to bring up the review questions, for example, just to emphasize what I had in my announcement last night, and B, to point out, yeah, here are the things to focus on right now, right? Which are going to be different than when we get to exam 3, right, on April 13th. At that point, things should be more together. Okay, that point, right? So that's what we're working toward. So let me just let me share my screen, just to highlight the kinds of things that I need you to focus on. So this is the exam. So if you go down under assignments for exams, and I used to have this exam prep as a like separate thing, but I put it right by the exams, right? And so exam prep, that's this page that we're on, right? And it has past exams and review questions, and they're all visible, including the ones for the next chapters as well. So let me do two things, and you can look at the past exam, past review questions, what I hope you did for exam 1. So let me bring up these review questions. I think I'm doing this to emphasize that I think they're useful. And are you going to see exactly these questions? Probably not. You could actually, but probably not exactly these questions. But are these questions representative of the kind of questions you're going to have to answer? Yes, absolutely. So, you know, this just goes through, it's really a sort of a reader's guide. So you can think about the videos that I've created, the new videos I've created this semester, the ones that chapter overviews for each chapter, right? Sort of a reading guide, right? Those are new ones that I'm doing as we do each chapter this semester. So that's kind of one way, a high level kind of overview to help think about the chapter that we're in before you have to do a homework, before even as you're doing a reading quiz, etc. Help to kind of put some things together. The idea is that plus the reading quiz should kind of help get you pretty grounded, at least to start with, and then the homeworks and other kinds of questions dig more deeply. We didn't have one on chapter 7 homework, but we did have homework on chapter 6. 7's a little bit different. We'll come back. I'm going to come back to that. All right, so you should be able to answer these questions. Right, some of these questions you actually had on the last homework. So that's why I said in the announcement last night, looking at the solutions for last homework is a good way to study as well. I will try and get, somebody asked yesterday, so when are we going to get back our homework 4? I try to get those back in a week. I was dealing with, and some of you know this because you have been involved in it, but dealing with the major kind of emergency in the department that absorbed most of my life last week. So thank you for those of you that know what I'm talking about and are involved in this, or in particular our Econ 315 right now. Thank you for your patience with that process. So that's led to some delay with that, but you have the solutions for that. Chapter 6 again, these questions, you should be able to answer these questions. And so you shouldn't just, I would actually encourage you not to just read them and say, yeah, I can do that, but actually sit down and write something out for each one of these. Like, does it have to be a full paragraph or page? No, but the more you do that, it engages more of your brain. So there's actually cognitive psychology behind this. You're not just sort of looking at it and reading and thinking about it. You are actually committing something down. You have to write it down. You have to actually put it together, and that engages more parts of your brain, and it's more likely to lead to long-term learning. It's more likely to take things that are in your short-term memory and embed them into your long-term memory, so that you can retrieve them later. That's what learning is all about from a cognitive science standpoint. It's encoding and memory creation, getting things in and keeping them in, and retrieval. Right, so those are big areas of research in cognitive psychology. So that helps with both the encoding of the material in your brain and the retrieval process, because you have to think about it. You got to retrieve things back from what do I know, the book, etc., to answer these questions. And then chapter 7, right, similarly. And so these are kind of a guide that just take you through the chapter. In addition to this, they don't have questions for the additional reading. We can talk about that during this time today, right now. The additional reading that I also gave you, talking about how the Federal Reserve actually carries out its monetary policy. It's not that complicated, but it's not something that's in the textbooks yet, as the authors point out. So you should be able to explain. You should be able to explain those readings in terms of how the Federal Reserve carries out monetary policy and the tools that it uses to do that. I'll talk about that in terms of, I can talk about that in terms of chapter 7 here. Okay. In addition, there's the schedule. Sorry. I want to point out this past exam too. Right, at the time back in 2018, we were face-to-face. I included some multiple choice questions on the exam. In addition to short answer questions, you will not see any multiple choice questions on the exam. It'll look exactly like exam 1. Like, it'll be exactly like that, I would say, right? In terms of the flavor, in terms of how it's going to feel, in terms of what you need to do. Okay, they're going to be short answer kinds of questions, problem kinds of questions, graphing kind of questions. But what you should do with this sample exam is think about how could that multiple choice question be an essay kind of question or a problem-based question. Generally, you can do that. Again, sort of like review questions. So you can use these for review as well. Somebody's going to ask me, are the solutions for that around? No, they're not. Okay, but that's why we have these kinds of sessions. So, and then you're going to see kinds of questions, and these will be representative of you don't have the space between them when you get them on your exam. You just get them sort of in line. But because these were meant to be done on paper. So I suggest that you take a look through the questions here as well. All right. And then also another thing that I pointed out in the announcement last night is section 9.3. Let me just take you there for a minute, and then we can kind of outline the major topics or answer specific questions that you have. Either way, I can go either way with that. So let me bring up from my side. You don't see some of those same links on your Blackboard site, but this is my way of getting into the course on the MyLab site. So if I bring up the Pearson eText, all right, in the same way that you do. Come on, there we go. What I mentioned was chapter 9, where we're headed next week in the announcement. So section 9.3, the asset market equilibrium. 9.2, you could look at that too, but really we didn't, in chapter 7, and I'm going to do a little review here. Chapter 7, we talked about the market for money, equilibrium in the asset market, which is the same as equilibrium in the market for money. And there's not actually a graph there, right? But I have talked about that, and in the videos for chapter 7, there is a graph of the market for money and money supply and money demand. It's there in words in chapter 7, but I don't know why, but they don't actually use the model, or sorry, the graph of the model until chapter 9, when we're going to bring all these things together. You can see labor market and the production function, goods market, the asset market. That's chapter 3, that's chapter 4, that's chapter 7, and then we're going to bring it all together. So section 9.3, this is what's in the announcement. Section 9.3 talks about where we get this thing called the LM curve, right? The liquidity and money equilibrium. So we'll get to that. We don't need to worry about the LM curve yet, not till next week. But the sections here are a useful way also to study and reflect back on the material from chapter 7, right? So the interest rate, non-monetary assets, right? So this gives you a little different lens on that material, but it's the same thing. It's not different. It's just a different presentation here. And then they actually have the graph of the money supply and money demand. So we talk about the demand for money in chapter 7. There is a table that shows what are the things that affect the demand for money. In other words, what are the things that either create this curve or shift that curve. And then the Federal Reserve is the one who's responsible for the money supply, right? So we're going to derive that LM curve from that. It's this part, right, that is exactly what is discussed in chapter 7. So that curve, or sorry, those curves, that graph is actually a useful way, and I think you'll find that to be helpful. So this section 9.3 that talks about money demand and money supply is actually useful. You don't need to worry about the LM curve part of that, but more just about the money demand, money supply itself, right? So I don't know why, like I said, they could have had sort of this part duplicated, or part of this in chapter 7 and talking about asset market equilibrium, right? We talked about demand for money, talk about asset market equilibrium, which is what demand and supply for money. So there's the graph that goes with that. So that's section 9.3, right? 9.3. And that's in the announcement from yesterday. All right, so I want to just point out all of those things. That was just really a duplication of what I had in the announcement, but I want to really emphasize these things. These are useful study tools. Okay, and they'll pay off. One of the things you should be telling yourself, or you should either have a question, or you should be telling yourself, like, well, it doesn't seem like there's as much stuff for this exam than for the first exam, right? Chapters 5, 6, and 7. I hope that you're feeling that way, because there's a lot of heavy lifting that happens in chapters 3 and 4 in particular. That's where the goods market first. It's the first time you see that stuff. First time you've been introduced to that kind of thinking in this sort of connected kind of way. And there's all we added is one more market to that, the market for money. And then economic growth, we talk about that a little differently. Chapter 5 is just a variation on chapter 4, which we've already had. So I would say there's not as much content covered on this exam. The next exam will have more, only in the sense that it kind of pulls everything together. But it's not more new stuff. We've done everything we're going to do in terms of the key pieces of our model. All right. So let me pause on that. Let me ask you for questions, and then we'll go in the direction that you want to go the rest of the time here.
I'm interested in just actually just going through the the review questions, and you know, just I guess I would like to go through all of them, but I don't. We probably don't have that kind of time on our hands. But if there was anything we didn't feel like we were finding through the information that you told us to study, whether it's the PowerPoint slides from the chapters or etc. Like you said, 9.3, he was telling us places where we can kind of resources where we can find the information that we need to study.
Yep.
Do you think maybe just going back, kind of like if I read chapter 5, would it answer every single question in that section? If I read chapter 6, would it answer every single question in that section? And so on with same with chapter 7.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that by also pointing out another resource just to make this clear. So I'm going to, if I go under Get Help, the online office hours and help sessions, right? So we scroll down to the bottom, the Friday sessions are meant to be kind of the help sessions of the Monday, Tuesday, like this are really sort of drop-in office hours, so I don't record those. But the Friday one, although I did at the beginning, because we had like today, and like today's, I will appear here as well, a review for the exam, right, help session. But you will see down here the sessions from last Friday and March 12th. We're actually, so this was before homework 4 was due. That's chapters 5 and chapter 6. So there were questions that were asked exactly along the lines that you were just mentioning. I suggest that you watch those videos because they're the videos of those sessions where I'm explaining things. And then in particular, the March 19th one where I'm talking about homework 4 questions, which have to do with material from chapters 5 and 6. So I'll answer the answer to your question is yes. Would you find things there? But here's the deal, all right? And something I've emphasized throughout the course, and you've seen it on homework, you've seen it on exams, is that I need you to be able to apply, right? Apply the material in those chapters. So you will see it again on this exam. I will give you something that's in the news currently, and ask you to apply the model to that. So what you need to do in that space is always be a translator, right? So it's the difference in anyway, I'm gonna put my face back up on the screen, but this is another thing to use for studying, right? So you need to be what I'm trying to help train you to be is a translator, right? To go from words in the general public to models to graphs back to words in terms of explaining using economics what's going on in the economy, right?
But isn't it kind of like I don't want to say it's not I mean it's not impossible, but people have different opinions.
Yeah,
Like,
it's not about but it's not, yes, that's correct. They don't, but they have, here's the deal. They come out as opinions, right? They have different assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're actually going to really dig into in chapter 9. So the different assumptions, so we need to put that in econ speak, right? The different assumptions have to do, first of all, with, and we need to understand this, first of all, in terms of what does that mean for our macro model? Well, first of all, it has to do with price and wage flexibility. How flexible are wages and prices? And that's not what you're probably thinking about in terms of assumptions, right? But that's critical because whether prices adjust quickly or not has implications and it has total implications for whether the government should get involved in the economy or not, or whether the Federal Reserve should get any. That's the main distinction. Now, what economics generally has not, it has to some extent, but not completely, right? Has not talked about equity issues, for example, as much. It has some, but it's not been the main focus, right? So the last 3 weeks, that's kind of partly, that's part of the issues. We want to look at the disaggregated economy, because we're looking usually at the whole economy, right? Treating everybody as they're just people in the economy, right? But we all know that there are different people, different groups, right? Could be age, could be race and ethnicity, could be gender, could be a whole gender identity. It could be a whole variety of things. Don't necessarily face the same markets and the same experiences in the marketplace. That, in terms of economic modeling, is simply an assumption, right? The assumption built into our models that we start with is everybody has the same access to capital, to loans, to everyone has the same access to jobs. We just talk about the labor market, right? We don't talk about discrimination. We talk about the labor market, right? But the reality is, if we take some of those assumptions away, then we can start getting to what ultimately comes out as, in what might seem like, opinions. But economists they do have opinions, but the opinions come from the models they work with, or another way of saying that is, they are reactions to the assumptions in the models we traditionally have used, and whether those models with those assumptions can model what's actually happening in the economy for significant groups of people. Again, the models are what we always have to come back to. So we say, well, yeah, but that's not been the experience for this group or that group, or for me, or whatever, right? Well, that's an interesting question. So what assumptions in the model do we need to look at? And what assumptions do we need to change, right, in order to try and better match up to what's going on in the real world? And so you can get people that have different models about how the economy works, which could lead to very different implications for economic policy, for interventions in the economy, right? And then the question is, whose assumptions are better representative? It's not opinion. It's not just whatever. It's informed opinion. It's informed by how we model things. Different assumptions lead to different models.
What's the difference in the models?
So if we assume that, for example, so one of the things that we assume in making decisions about desired saving, we assume that consumers make utility maximizing decisions about how much to save and spend between the current period and the future period, right? The assumption in that model is that everyone has access. The way we draw graphically, the way we do this in terms of a budget line, the way you could do it in microeconomics, it's a microeconomics foundation, we would assume on the budget line that in the current period, you don't just have access to your income this period, but you can borrow against your future expected income, right? So that enlarges your consumption set today. But what if that's not true? What if there's discrimination and redlining so that people in certain socioeconomic groups, certain geographic areas, certain whatever, right? Certain skin colors, so whatever, certain genders, so whatever the case, certain immigrant status, whatever the case might be. What if that's not true? That changes our model. That changes our budget line in that model. It changes the implications potentially for that model, right? So economists, that's what we do. We try and model things and not just sort of talk off the cuff. Now, what you hear in a newscast and MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, whatever, is you hear people just talking, right? Because they're not going to go and talk about ISLM or aggregate demand, aggregate supply, curves and stuff like people like tune out, like whatever, they're going to talk. But what's behind what they're saying are the models. And that's the way I want you to be able to think. You need to be able to think that as an economist. And when you know, so somebody asked me to come and talk at WFMY News or WFDD Radio News, right? Or anybody in our department, but I've done it too. So they ask you, like, we need to have something, you know, in 2 hours, you know, so you have to like think about this. Like, you can't be an expert about this particular thing. What do? You're thinking about through the lens of the economic models. Well, what would those things suggest? So it's not me just talking off the cuff what I think or my opinions about it, right? That would be silly for me to do that, because and anybody's opinions are just as good as anybody else's in that case. But why do they want to talk to somebody from an economics department? Because they thought through these things in a systematic kind of way, and they use models to think about things. Again, now, then you say, well, why do economists could disagree? You could have somebody else on a program like that has a very different outcome, right? A different view about that, because they have different assumptions about how the models that they're thinking about, how the world works, right? Literally, that's the thinking. They're not just sort of just talking off the cuff without some way of structuring their thoughts, right? So there's something structuring people's thoughts, right? And economists' thoughts, right? And you know, that's what makes it interesting, because there's not just one model, right? That's the point. We have to learn to think in model kind of speak, right? We need to, that's what we do. And that's as an economics major, that's the whole training, right? It really, in a sense, is to get you to think analytically, analyze things. To analyze things, you got to break things down, and we use models and theory to do that. But sometimes what we end up with doesn't match up with what's in the real world, in the real world experience. And then we say, well, why is that not the case? Maybe we need to think about different models to do that, right? And so different economists do have different views about things depending on their assumptions. And so ultimately, in most cases, the disagreement is about the underlying assumptions. That's the disagreement between economists, right? Because the assumptions drive everything, you know? And so, you know, it could be that different assumption, and it could be that different assumptions lead to different models for different people, right? Different groups of people, not every individual, I'm saying, but, you know, and so when something sort of a standard model that we've looked at that's why we're doing the last 3 weeks of the course, is to get you thinking beyond just the model here, because I want to whet your appetite, partly because, like, hey, I'd like to do research on that sort of stuff, like, and we need more people thinking about those kinds of things that extend the models that we have, right, to better capture what's going on, and not just in the US, because not just a US centric view, but in the world economy, right? Because different systems and societies have very different assumptions about how things work, right? If you're in Iraq, it'd be very different than the United States, for example, right? But their economies in both places, they're macro economies. There's inflation, there's real GDP, there's unemployment, there's employment, right? We have to have different models for those. Different institutional structures, rule of law, for example, all right, and other things like that. So, you know, there are a lot of things underlying our model that we assume that are hidden. They're hidden under the surface. And then one of the, you know, first thing we're going to tackle is this price flexibility one. That's a big one. That turns out, but that's not what most people think about when they think about those assumptions. But then we can go from there. We can go from there. It makes a point. Makes the point that depending on what the assumptions you have, you get different outcomes and different roles, in particular for policy and government. Right. And we could have other different kinds of assumptions that we could look at then as well, right? Discrimination, access to capital, etc. And that's the work that I hope some of you will do after you graduate, all right? Public policy and the government, etc. But I want you to have the tools to be able to start thinking about that process, right? All right, so let's get back to chapters 5, 6, and 7. All right, so yeah, we can't go through it sort of literally through each one of the questions, right? Or each one of the review questions. But what can we do, right? So I need you to think broadly. What are the things in each in each one of these chapters. Whoops, I was going to start writing on my pad and not share the screen. And I do that all the time because I get excited about what we want to do. So let me just, if you have specific questions, just jump in. All right, just jump in. So don't let me just kind of go on. If you got specific things that you want from this session right now, you know, and I can go a little bit longer. We're at 10:43. You know, we have 17 minutes here, but I can go a bit longer till quarter after if we need to. But let me just sort of lay out sort of the way you need to be thinking about it. You need to structure your thinking, and then you can dig into the chapters. Yes, Eric, as you were saying, you can dig into the chapters to get into the weeds, right? So chapter 5. So what's chapter 5 about? I just want to get everybody's heads in the same place. All right. So we have chapter 5.
It's about
chapter 6.
Trade.
Chapter 7. Yep. So it's about trade
and trade deficits.
Trade deficits. So trade deficits. What else?
The relationship between savings and investment.
Okay, so we have saving and investment in an open economy, right? Open economy means we got other countries. All right.
Right.
So that chapter starts out with something called the balance of payments. BOP, balance of payments. So key idea in that chapter, I would say the balance of payments and this open economy goods market. And then we can have other things underneath that. But those are the two big ideas in that chapter. So there are two ways that I think it's useful to study. One is to structure what's in these chapters in a systematic kind of way. These are your notes that you can use on the exam. It's going to be exactly the same, open book. I encourage you to make notes and think about the structure so that you get a question like, oh, that deals with that. And I don't have to like dig in to go into the textbook and dig into all this stuff at that point, right? You should have some familiarity. So what's one of the big takeaways from this balance of payments? What is the balance of payments made up of?
Investing in foreign nations and debt that we accumulate from other nations.
Okay, that's part of it. Let's structure that. Let's refine that, right? So literally, so what is a balance of payments? Balance of payments. What is it dealing with?
The current account and financial account.
So, okay, so the current account and the financial account, right? But and so generally, let's even break it. So that's right. We're going to come back to that. That's exactly right. Right. And that's related to what Eric was just talking about as well. He was talking about part of the financial account, right? So the balance of payments, just generally, just in words, what does it have to do with? I mean, like at the most basic level.
Trade and money.
Well, money. Well, let's just start with money, right? It has to do with dollar inflows and outflows. I mean, that's it. That's the deal. That's it. Dollar inflows are pluses. Dollar outflows are minuses in the balance of payments. But then why are dollars flowing in and flowing out? Well, dollars are flowing in and flowing out either to buy goods and services, right, from other countries, or other countries buying our stuff, right? That's what's in the current account. That's exports and imports. And net factor payments. But, you know, for the most part, we're going to, we ignore that part just to keep life even simpler, right? Doing models is about simplifying things. We could add that. We could add that back in. But, so net exports. So Current account is all about dollar flows in and out having to do with imports and exports. Psh, that's it. Simple as that. All right. So like, don't overcomplicate things. All right. What does the financial account have to do with? Well, it has to do with dollar inflows and dollar outflows, but about for what?
Taking loans out with other nations.
Yeah. Yeah. More buying their securities, assets, but loans. It's a form. We could actually be direct loans as well. So it's about dollar inflows and outflows, buying and selling assets, not goods and services. Assets. Assets are what? Assets could be real assets like real estate, right? That's why it's called real estate, right? It's a real stuff. It's stuff you can, like, tangible. You can put your hands on it. A building, right? Ground, a golf course, right? Real estate, real asset, or financial assets, right? Financial assets. What are financial assets? Those are like stocks and bonds. The bonds could be private, or they could be the government bonds. In fact, that's a key one. That's a critical one. So if you can do kind of this mapping of your notes, right? If you can create a map of your notes, kind of an outline, but we're kind of mapping that. You can create a graphical map of how things are connected. That's a really useful way of studying, right? A graphic, sometimes called a graphic organizer, right? But a graphical representation of the topics in a chapter. Because what we're going to talk about is we want to relate government bonds. Why? Because government bonds have to do with budget deficits. That's how the US government finances its budget deficits. It prints government treasury bonds and sells them in the open market. They're open market operations. Federal Reserve does, right? Buying and selling government bonds. But people in other countries can buy those bonds. They can buy our debt. It's essentially, we are borrowing from other countries. They get the treasury bonds, but we got to pay them back at some point in the future. So that, yes, they're lending us money. When we sell, when dollars come in, a dollar inflow in the financial account, right, to buy financial assets in the US from the Chinese, the Japanese, the Canadians, the Mexicans, whoever. Germans are buying government bonds in the US. We get that money. The US government gets that money, right, ultimately, and then they can spend, right? So dollars are flowing in, right? That's a plus for the financial account, right? But other countries get the asset, which adds to their wealth, right? We're borrowing. If we continue to borrow more and more, maybe we're a net lender, maybe we're a net borrower as a country, right? Depends. It depends what we do with it. So if we take that borrowed money from government, right? So the government, US government, runs a budget deficit, right? We've talked about this on more than one occasion, in these sessions, these weekly sessions anyway. And if the government borrows money, then it depends, is that good or bad? Well, other countries are holding on, other countries are going to be holding on to some of these treasury bonds. Well, that's you say, well, that's not good, because that we're just getting more in debt to other countries then. Well, but it depends, right? It depends what we use the money for. So if the government runs a budget deficit to pay for, I was just reading it on Breakfast Today in the local paper, as well as in the Wall Street Journal, right? Because Biden administration is getting closer to getting an infrastructure. I mean, Congress is already working on this, but they're really pushing for an infrastructure bill now that the stimulus package for the coronavirus pandemic has passed, right? And is in law, and checks are going out and whatnot. And so for what? For ports, for bridges, for roads, for broadband access, right? In rural areas and across the country. All those kinds of things. And then a second part of that infrastructure bill has to do with human infrastructure. What does that mean? oh, so maybe universal preschool, free universal preschool, for example, maybe free college tuition, maybe repayment of college loans, although that's not, I don't think that's in there, but things that are aimed at increasing what? Human capital, right? So if those things end up being productive investments and increase our real GDP, our income, then we can pay off those treasury bonds to those other countries and still be ahead. Exactly analogous to you taking out a student loan. I've used this example numerous times now. Exactly analogous to you taking out a student loan. You say, well, I'm worse off. I'm in debt. Well, it depends what you do with it. If you get your economics degree and you get good grades and you end up getting a great job, right? And you've increased your income from what you would have had compared to having no college degree, right? Whatever major, but no college degree, then yeah, you can pay off those loans and you have a nice house, a nice car, a nice life, right? You can still, you're still ahead, and you're further ahead than you would have been had you not taken out the loan and invested in your own human capital to begin with, right? So,
Okay.
so
um,
I want to bring that back to one. So that's the way that this, like, you can look in the chapter and say, well, this is what the current account is. This is what the financial account is. But you got to think about, how does that connect with things? All right. So I want to add one last piece on this one. All right. What's a key? So what you've seen is we have these key kind of, well, key graphs and key equations, really simple equations. Right? We have the uses of saving identity, right? The saving equals investment plus the CA. We've been using that a lot. You're going to see more about that on this exam. You will. But what do we know? What do we know from chapter 5? Another one of these. We know that the current account plus the financial account equals 0. The two of them have to, that's why it's called the balance of payments. They have to balance out. So dollars flowing out to buy goods and services have to come back to buy some kind of asset, right? And vice versa. So we know that if the current account is going down, we know the financial account is going up. So we can say all these things about the current account has to do with net exports. It also has to do with if our financial account is going, I mean, dollars are flowing in, but if dollars are flowing in, it means we're selling assets, right? The dollars are coming in. That means we're lending more, becoming more of a lender. Borrowing more, sorry. Right? These are all saying the same thing. Our trade deficit getting bigger. Right? Those are all, and there's a summary box in chapter 5 that talks exactly about that. So yes, if you go back and dig into the chapter, is it there? Yes, absolutely. Right? And then we can ask questions, we can ask questions about that. So we can relate it to other things like the current account. We also know that in the open economy, the current account in one country, in the home country, has to be the opposite of the current account in the foreign country. That's what we mean by equilibrium in that case. So what does that mean? What do we know from up here? That the CA equals, if we bring FA to the other side, is minus FA, or FA is equal to minus the CA, right? So minus CA, that means the current account in the home country has got to be equal to the, right, the finance account in the other country, right? So now we know what is CA? It's S minus I. We know that from this uses of saving identity we use over and over and over again, right? And that has to equal minus CA over here, or investment minus saving. Well, what does that mean? The excess saving in one country has to be offset by a saving shortage in the other country, right? So in the world economy, countries don't just borrow within their own country. they can borrow across countries. So if one country at the world interest rate is saving more than there is desired investment at that real interest rate, they can lend out those funds to another country who's willing to borrow at that world interest rate, right? And that, in fact, that's how the world interest rate gets determined. So that's how we get to the graphs for, right? And I suggest that you go look at those videos for chapter 5, but also the ones for the review sessions for last week. And so we can, if this is the home country and foreign country, then we can find the real world interest rate. This is RINS. Going to be something about like here, where that distance is equal to that distance. So there's, saving and investment, saving and investment. So over here, saving is greater than investment. Over here, at that interest rate, I is equal to S. That distance is exactly equal to that distance, which is the same thing as what we said up there. So equilibrium doesn't mean where the lines cross. All right, that's the basic idea for chapter 5. What's the basic idea for chapter 6? Economic growth. And we're only doing a couple of the sections in that chapter. It's actually pretty straightforward. So what are we talking about economic growth? What are we talking about?
We're talking about, I mean, we could be talking about something as simple as an increase in human intellectual capacity, or an increase in technology.
Yes, and ultimately to what end? So when we talk about growth of what?
Maybe education. Ultimately
in economics, in that chapter, in economics and macroeconomics, what are we focusing? Growth of what?
Productivity.
Those are all things that lead to growth of the economy. Output, real GDP. All right, talking about what causes real GDP to grow over time. So there's an assumption under that. Let me go back to your point before, Eric. There's an assumption under that we care about real GDP because that means more stuff available to people, right? More goods and services available. Remember back in chapter 2, how we measure GDP, goods, services, et cetera, capital, right? But there are some economists who would say, but that's not what we should care about. We should care about happiness and well-being, and that is not synonymous with real GDP. So there are different economists that vary, but that's the underlying assumption is that it's not real GDP that we should be focusing on, it's something else, right? And they have reasons for that. So we change the assumption, right? And we get different outcomes. But for us right now, the assumption is real GDP. Why do we do that? Because there's a positive correlation between growth and real GDP and a whole bunch of other economic indicators, length of life, right? Infant mortality is kind of an interesting one because the U.S. doesn't necessarily stand out in terms of developed countries in terms of infant mortality. It's kind of an interesting one, but in terms of a whole variety of economic indicators, many of them are tied to higher real GDP positively. So the higher real GDP can lead to higher well-being measured in that way. But aside from that, right, and focus this on this more microeconomics, like, well, but if that leads to more pollution and unsustainable planet, climate change, well, that's a problem, right? So now the assumption was that increasing real GDP didn't have any negative effects overall on the whole climate. But if that assumption is not true, right, then we got to change that assumption. And so economists use different models to include the assumption that, oh yes, increasing real GDP does have climate change impacts. Well, you're going to get a different result in that case, right? It's the assumption that's different. It's not just what somebody thinks, right? It's not just an opinion about something. It's using the science, it's using et cetera to inform the assumptions. All right, so what do we know? Where did we first encounter real GDP? Back in chapters 2 and 3. In chapters 2, how do we measure real GDP? But chapter 3, we have this production function, right? Y equals, this is the stuff that you were just talking about, Eric. And Y is a function of labor, capital, and total factor productivity, A, which is affected by education, which is affected by technology, etc. So the point is, we can break down what affects real GDP, which is Y, into 3 different bins: capital, labor, total factor productivity. Janine, I see your hand up.
Yeah, bring me to a question. So why exactly is productivity growth explained as a residual?
All right, so Y is equal to A. Let me use we could do it generally, but let me use the Cobb-Douglas production function that's used in the book. All right. We talked about this. This is actually, we talked about this last week in the session. So, do we have data for real GDP? Yes, right? Do we have data for employment?
We do.
Yes.
Yes.
Do we have data for the capital stock? Yes, we do. Machines, number of machines, intellectual property, right? Yes, we have data about that. Macro data about that. We can measure that in the US economy. Do we have data about total factor productivity? No. No. So what is total factor productivity just conceptually? For a given level of labor and capital that we have in the economy, bigger increases in A increase output, right? So what kinds of things are like that? Education. So same number of workers, but workers that are more productive because they can read, because they can program, because they can whatever, right? All sorts of different things. They can use a computer, all right, to help do their job. All right. So education, technology, etc., go into that A. All right. It could be different ways of putting that labor and capital together. If I want to go back to the early 20th century, early 1900s, right? So Henry Ford, right, thought of a new way of producing cars, or producing things, cars, called a production line, right? Assembly line. So instead of one person doing all the parts to make a car or a machine, you split it out into a whole bunch of different people, each doing a repetitive process over and over again so they get really good at it, right? So instead of 10 people each producing one car themselves, you have those 10 people on an assembly line, each doing a specific piece of that production, but getting really good at it. And those 10 people in a week can produce way more cars than they could if each one was working individually. Same number of people, same number of machines, right? So A can also be different production techniques that use the same capital, the same labor, but in different ways. So Henry Ford. The Henry Ford example is one that is kind of an easy one, right, in that sense. It could be reprogramming computers to take advantage of machine learning, AI, etc. New technology in that sense. All right, so what is A then? Let's bring this to the other side. Just divide that Y divided by n to the 0.7, k to the 0.3 equals A. Right? So A gets determined after we determine that. So if you had a spreadsheet, right, we could, in fact, this is done in chapter 6. There's a table, and it shows here's Y, here's K, here's N, here's Y. So once we determine that, we know what A is. We don't have a direct measurement of A. A is determined as a residual. A is determined as what's left. Here's another way we can think about that goes beyond, that's simple. That's just the simplest way to think about it. If I take logs of both sides of above, if I take natural logs of that, if I want to do the math, all right, I have log of real GDP equals the log of A plus the log of, this is the math behind that, log of n plus the log of k to the 0.3, all right, equals ln A plus 0.7 times ln log of n plus 0.3 the log of k. This looks like a production, this looks like a regression equation. Y equals alpha plus beta 1 x1 plus beta 2 x2. x2 is the log of k, x1 is the log of n. We have data for n, we have data for k, we can use regression, we can use econometrics to estimate that equation, right? We get a constant. What is that? That's the log. That's what's left after we've estimated those parts. It's the residual. So it's y minus beta 1 x1 minus beta 2 x2, beta hat. We'll put hats on there once we estimate it. That equals alpha, which is what the log of A is, and we can take the exponential of that and get A. A is a residual after you've accounted for x1, we said is labor and capital and output, right?
So residual
left?
income.
No, it's just the unexplained, it's the unexplained part of GDP once we take into account labor and capital.
And that's residual income. Okay.
Not residual income. It's just don't think about it as a residual income. Just think about that's what's, so if we're trying to explain what drives GDP, right? Labor and capital do, but we don't have a direct measurement of A. But we can figure out A once we have labor, capital, and GDP. It's just a mathematical residual. It's a residual in a regression equation, is what it is. It's what's left after you've estimated the equation.
I mean, it's definitely math. I mean, you can break it down to the mathematical through that function, but I mean,
residual income sounds like something for people, like something that's left for people. That's not the way to think about that.
But it couldn't be done on a macro level. Like, couldn't the country have residual income?
Yeah, but I don't know what that means.
I mean, and the country does have residual income. So basically, like, I guess that would be equivalent to like someone who has like a rental property, right?
No, don't.
Yeah.
This is not related to that at all. No, not related to that at all. That's why I say don't even equate that in your mind. It's a technical term. This is a technical phrase. This is a technical idea, right? Total factor, we talk about this thing called A. We talk about this thing called total factor productivity, but we don't have a direct measurement of it. Robert Solow, who the chapter, part of the chapter that we did not do, the Solow growth model. I talked about this with some of you last week in a session. He won the Nobel Prize for this idea, partly, I mean, related to the Solow growth model, but that's related to this idea of A as a residual. It's what's left. We can't explain it. It's just there. It's what's left after we use the other stuff to explain. And that's not very satisfying in some sense. It won him the Nobel Prize, but other economists, another section that we did not cover in chapter 6, because we didn't need to, is trying to understand, like, well, what causes A? And so decisions about saving, investment in an economy drive A. So he wants to make this not exogenous, not just a residual, but some explanation for what's A, what drives A, right? Rather than what's left that we can't explain, right? So no, it's a technical idea. We don't have any direct measurement of A, but we talk about it, A. So what Solow won what ends up being the important thing in the Solow growth model, and we can get to it without having to go through that whole model, is that in the end, changes in A is what drive standard of living.
And A is
But all we can say is like A is what's left after we can't explain the other stuff. Like, so
and A stands for what exactly?
Total factor productivity.
Total factor productivity.
Right. So now we can go back to what I was saying at the very beginning of this answer is that total fact for a given amount of labor, for a given amount of capital, they can produce a certain amount of GDP. With that same amount of labor, same amount of capital, like 100 and 100. Now, if A gets bigger, we get more real GDP with the same amount of labor, the same amount of capital, right? That's why it's called total factor productivity. It increases the productivity of labor and capital together. Those are the factors of production, and A helps increase the productivity of both of those together. So it's not just labor productivity, what makes labor more productive, or not just what makes capital more productive. It's what makes the combination of the two more productive in terms of being able to produce more output. So it's a conceptual idea. A is conceptual. We can't measure it directly. It's a residual. It's what's left, the part that we can't explain. Yeah. So that's chapter 6 is about what's the contribution of labor and capital to GDP and total factor productivity, overall total factor productivity, and what are the implications of that for economic growth over time. So that was part of what the last homework was about, this Congressional Budget Office report that I had referred to in the last question of homework number 4, for example, which lays things out exactly along these lines, this growth accounting idea. Yes, and you can go directly in chapter 6 and see exactly, you can dig into that and see what that is, right? So to go back. And then let me just finish up with chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a little different than sort of any other chapter in some sense. So chapter 7 has to do with money. All right, what is it? All right, this is the beginning part. How do we measure it? That's where we talk about M1, M2, like what are those things? Right, this is directly out of principles of macroeconomics, Econ 201. Like we do that, and we do that. There's a chapter on that in macro in Econ 201 about money in the Federal Reserve, right? And that's why we care about it. Why do we care about this stuff? Because that's tied to Federal Reserve. I'm going to be really clear about that. Federal Reserve, we call it Fed policy, but Federal Reserve policy. Because what does the Federal Reserve do? They change the money supply. They change interest rates. That's where that other reading that I also indicated that we need to look at, right? In addition to chapter 7, why I moved back the exam was to be able for you to dig into that other reading by Scott Walla and Ihrig, I believe is the name. I know, like I said, I know Scott at the St. Louis Federal Reserve, and that is an attempt to understand, well, how does the Fed actually carry out its monetary policy? It's not quite the way it says in the textbook. That's kind of old school prior to 2008, 2009. Could go back to that again, but they do it a bit differently. But it doesn't change the ultimate story in that the Federal Reserve can change interest rates, whether it's through the money supply, whether it's directly by setting interest rates on reserves that banks hold with the Federal Reserve. It doesn't matter in some sense. It has policy tools to be able to do that. Okay, but ultimately, and it's about wealth. How do people hold their wealth? All right, so they either hold their wealth in terms of monetary assets or non-monetary assets. Non-monetary assets could be real estate, could be stocks, bonds, things that aren't money, stocks, bonds, etc. Bonds, right? Monetary assets are money. That's what I mean, money. Bank accounts, savings accounts, checking accounts, M1 and M2. That's why. So the whole part of the point about that is, what are the things that affect how people hold their wealth? What kind of assets? Things like the real interest rate on non-monetary assets matters. Risk, liquidity, other things, all of those things matter in terms of how people hold on to their wealth. All right, they'll matter for you in day-to-day life, how you hold on to how you distribute your wealth in terms of your retirement account. Right? To what extent do you have it in bonds versus stocks versus an overall stock index, etc.? You'll be able to manage that. That's going to determine your retirement, right? How you manage that, your retirement accounts, right? So that's what this is all about, in essence, right? And then you could also you're going to put some of your income ultimately in buying a house, probably, or buying a car, or other kind of assets that you have. So ultimately, that allows us to say, okay, if we figure out equilibrium in one of these markets, broadly speaking, non-monetary assets and monetary assets, we figure out equilibrium in the other one. So we can just focus on the market for money, real money demand, and real money supply. And really, that's all we need to know. So this is that stuff back. This is the graph that's in chapter 9.3 that I mentioned in the announcement, in particular last night, right? But it has to do exactly with what's in chapter 7. They just don't have the graph there. The discussion in chapter 7 is exactly this. It's exactly that. They just don't do the last step and draw the graph. So in chapter 9, we're going to use this model to talk about how we pull all the markets together to come up with ISLM, FE model, or aggregate demand area supply model. So the idea here is that if there are changes in demand, how people want to hold on to their assets or their wealth in terms of money, and the Federal Reserve, for example, is trying to keep the interest rate at a certain level through its monetary policy, it can do that by changing the money supply, right? The Federal Reserve is the one who controls this. They can set whatever money supply level they want by buying and selling government securities, or they can set their interest rate. Really, this is really the way to think about it. They can set the interest rate in the economy by, this is the other piece, this is another reading that I provided for you. They really do that by, one of the tools they use is paying interest on reserves to banks that keep deposits with the Federal Reserve. By doing that, they can set the federal funds rate, which is a really short-term interest rate. Other interest rates tend to move with the federal funds rate. So they can move the interest rates around in the economy through monetary policy. So we're going to talk much more about that in chapter 9. This is just kind of the setup for that.
Okay. This was a quick question I wanted to ask you earlier. It's still kind of on my mind. Okay. And it relates to chapter 5. The budget deficit. So if we're taking the loans from other countries, the deficit, and we're investing it to be more productive, then it's a good thing. But on the contrary, if we're budgeting, I mean, if we're receiving these loans, and we have a deficit, and we're not as productive, that's not a good thing. But based on on our macro economy in the past 50 years or so, I mean, we've been slightly more productive each year, which I mean, it's not what I think, which should occur because our population grows annually. But
Right. That doesn't make us more, that doesn't make our population growing doesn't make us more productive, though. It just means more people are working. That is
Right,
that doesn't make us more productive. In fact, it could make us less productive. Productivity has to do with output per worker.
But the reason why I say that, okay, so if you look at big cities have the best economies in the United States.
Maybe,
but it's because
maybe
it's more
not necessarily. Maybe some do. Some do.
And even if you look at like China, how they dominate, it's because they have like a vast population.
So
how can our economy compete with theirs when they have more buyers?
So how do they dominate? Our real GDP is higher than theirs. Our standard of living is higher than theirs. So I'm not sure what that means. What do you mean when you say that?
They're not operating at a deficit. They're not. They have
sure they are.
Money. They technically have more money than us.
No, they don't. Their real GDP is not higher.
They're not as productive as us.
In certain areas, maybe, but overall, no. The way we usually think about standards of living is real GDP per person, right? Mm-hmm. They have a lot more people, but real GDP per person, that's the standard of living. That's how many slices of pizza you have out of the pizza. So no, they're not a dominant. They're not a dominant country in that sense.
I just so while we've been taking these loans over these years, it's not me and you, but
we're not taking loans generally. We're not taking loans. Like we don't go to like a Chinese bank and borrow money from a Chinese bank. That's not, I mean, just to be clear about that, that's not right. What you're saying is generally true, but that's not generally the way it works, right? What happens is government runs a budget deficit in the United States. They print treasury bonds, they put them on the open market, and the Chinese buy some of them. That's it. But yes, in essence, what we're doing is borrowing to the extent that other countries buy our treasury bonds. They don't have to. They're just out in the market. But if they choose to do that, whether it's Chinese, whether it's the Germans, whether it's the Italians, whether it's Russians, whether it's Mexicans, it doesn't matter. Those treasury bonds are now being held by somebody in another country, and we owe them that money as a country 30 years in the future. Let's say it's a 30-year bond, right? In return, we have the dollars from selling those to them. Question is, what do we do with those dollars? So here's the difference. Well, so here's the way to think about that. There's a piece in the Wall Street. There's a little blurb in the Wall Street Journal. One of the little pieces that I was reading this morning. Right. So, right. So Robinhood, right, is one of the new investing apps. It makes it really, really simple for people who've never done investing before in stocks and stocks, let's say, right? To do it, to buy and sell stock, right? Robinhood, right? Isn't that the app? Robinhood? I don't have it.
That's one of them.
Yeah, that's one of them. So there've been a slew of these, right, that have been developed to make it simple for people, and in particular, not just, but particular young people have sort of really gotten into this, right? Because it's not just them, but it's been a big expansion, right? So Ameritrade and others have seen a big expansion of younger investors, new first-time kind of people. So interestingly, this is what the little blurb was about today. When the U.S. government sent out the first stimulus checks, pandemic related stimulus checks last year, when Trump, at the end of the Trump administration, all right, $1,200 checks. So places like Ameritrade and others, right? These other places and Robinhood, et cetera, they saw a significant increase in people depositing money in their accounts there, right? Of exactly $1,200. They were using the money not to buy groceries, make rent payments. They were using it to invest in stocks. Like what? Like GameStop, right? And is that a productive? So if those $1,200, if the government budget deficit that led to the $1,200 payments, that led to them putting money into GameStop, right? Is that increase the productivity of the economy? No. Like even if GameStop was doing okay, like, okay, they're producing video games, like, okay, whatever, like, does that help us produce more real GDP in the future? No. Like that. Now compare instead of that, right? On the other hand, if somebody took their $1,200 checks and that helped them to pay for childcare, helped them to buy a car, that they could get a job, et cetera, or go to community college or whatever the case might be, is that going to increase productivity in the future? Yes, right? Probably yes. They can get it, or alternatively, if they could, or you take the money, the government takes money, whatever, however many $1 trillion, right? And then instead uses that to invest in and pay for new roads and bridges and new universal preschool, free preschool, let's say. Does that increase productivity? Absolutely, right? So it depends how you use the money. Depends what you're spending the money on.
Has the government failed us in the past 50 years as far as investing with our trade deficit?
No, so that's right. So that is an empirical question. That's an interesting question for economists to look at. How has the government used the money that it's gotten from its trade deficits? Yeah, that's a relevant question.
And the Fed decides that, or is it Congress?
Congress.
Both.
Congress.
Congress.
No, the Federal Reserve's not involved in that at all. Actually, no.
Okay.
Congress and the president. That's Congress and the president.
That's what I was saying.
That's why we elect people, right? Because you and I, we all get a direct vote on that question.
Right.
If we don't think that government's doing that, but now, so of course, like this can help inform your thinking about that. Not to tell you which way to vote, but can help inform your thinking process.
But see, that's another thing. I think both of them are. Neither one of them are doing anything. I mean,
that's a different question for a different day. That's not for right now. So I want to make sure we're focused on this. I might agree with you on that, but anyway, I don't know. It depends. I mean, it depends on the day, right? But that's neither here nor there. For us right now in this course, that's a relevant question to ask as a citizen and a voter, right? Yeah, absolutely, right? But our job in this course is to help frame the thinking so that we can be clearer about the choices that we make, opportunity costs that we make, or opportunity costs that we're considering, what our assumptions are, what are, et cetera, right? It's to help be clearer about our thinking, not thinking in a particular way, but because one could make very cogent, analytically sound arguments and come up with very different conclusions. And ultimately, it's not one that's right or wrong necessarily. It's which one has assumptions that you believe at the end of the day that you believe are more relevant or you value more. It's not necessarily a matter of truth. It may be that somebody values one thing more than another. All right. So and again, in a democracy, that's why we vote.
Right. But it's like, you know, we'll have, you know, the Democrats would dominate Congress, nothing significant changes. Republicans would dominate Congress, nothing would really change. So I mean, there's just,
I don't know.
I
We'll
don't
see.
know.
We'll see. We'll see. No, a lot of people would say, when you, so I'm gonna take you to task on both of those, on both sides of that, right? So during the last 4 years, naming multiple Supreme Court justices is not a big deal. You ask any, so on the Republican side, you ask any Republican, say, yes, amen. On the Democratic side, now we'll go to that side, right? Passing, I'll go back in time, passing legislation for a major healthcare legislation, Obamacare, right? That wasn't a big deal. Pre-existing conditions, so allowing people to not have to pay more for pre-existing conditions or be excluded from healthcare. Those are huge deals. So no, I don't think that's true at all. I think while there is a lot of gridlock, there's a lot that happens when a particular party is in power politically. That's why voting really matters. Whichever side you're on of that.
Right. It does. I think it does, but I'm just saying, like, I feel like there's so much stuff that needs to be done, and I feel like not enough gets done.
Well, that's fine. I mean, that right. People can differ about that and argue about that, and I mean, we could be at that one for like the rest of the day if we wanted to be. Yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, those are valid. Those are potentially valid arguments. One has to back them up, but yeah, and people can have different views on that. Yeah. So that part is not generally what we're going to focus on in this class, because we're trying to focus on how do we analyze things. At the end of the day, people have to make decisions, and partly that's going to depend on their own individual